I'm sitting next to a bucket of stinky sludge. Now, normally you wouldn't have stinky sludge in your garden, but this bucket is going to benefit my plants for free. Join me today as I show you how to make your own fertilizer. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this bucket is just the first step in the process of creating my own fertilizer so that I can supply the nutrients to my plants. And the concept is very basic. You select plants that are naturally growing in your garden that are also naturally high in some of the nutrients and elements that other plants need, and then taking those plants, putting them in a bucket, covering them with water, and allowing all of those wonderful nutrients to leach out into the water. And that water becomes your fertilizer. While you can make fertilizer with any plants in your garden, there are some that are better and, in fact, best to use to make your own fertilizer. All plants need nutrients, and you know about nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. There are 3 other macronutrients that are important: calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, and a whole bunch of micronutrients that plants need in much smaller amounts. Well, one of the best plants that you can use that's loaded with nutrients is dandelions. Now, normally I let dandelions grow throughout my landscape. They're great for beneficial insects, they're improving the soil, and all parts of the plant are edible. I only use the dandelions in sections that I'm weeding for the growing of other plants. And the thing that makes the dandelion so wonderful is it's high in all of those macronutrients. It also has iron and boron and manganese. So by starting our fertilizer blend with dandelions, we're really choosing a good plant. Now, one of the reasons why many gardeners think dandelions make such a great fertilizer is because of the concept of dynamic accumulators. The idea is that a plant, a dynamic accumulator, has a deep taproot. It goes down into the soil, takes all the nutrients deeper down, and brings them up into the leaves. It's important to note that there's no scientific research to show how that correlates to fertilizers and growing other plants in the garden. The name and the idea of the dynamic accumulator was really popularized by Robert Couric in his 1986 book about edible landscaping. But everything is anecdotal from that book and from this point forward in this video. Not because of any scientific research, and I love scientific research. It's one of those ideas that seems to work, and if you're willing to put in the little bit of effort, it might pay dividends for your plants. Now, I started with dandelions from this bed. While I'll let dandelions grow around the edges of my garden, I don't like the dandelions growing in the middle of my strawberries. So I went ahead and dug them out at the beginning of the season, and taking those dandelions, roots, leaves, the entire plant, and sticking them into that white bucket. And then with all those dandelions in the bucket, I just added regular water from my hose. I'm not worried about the chlorine in my water supply for this process because the chlorine dissipates pretty quickly, and this process takes a number of weeks. For me, it's a 3-week process. Now, I could have stopped with just the dandelions. Making that dandelion tea or dandelion extract is enough to give the plants that you're growing those extra nutrients. You can also make a tea using stinging nettle. If there's a garden plant that's better than dandelions, it's the stinging nettle. It has all of those macronutrients. It's particularly high in the calcium and magnesium and sulfur. It also has zinc and copper, and it's a wonderful plant. The reason I'm growing this plant in my garden is for that fertilizer aspect. To mix things up a little bit, literally, I decided to go ahead and use the stinging nettle along with the dandelions so that my fertilizer has extra nutrients, more than just the dandelions alone. And this plant was much taller, so I decided to go ahead and top the plant, taking off about the upper 1/3, and that's what I added to my bucket of dandelions. Now, I could have stopped there, but I decided to go ahead and add a third plant to my blend, and that's comfrey, because I'm growing comfrey in my garden to use in my fertilizer blend. Comfrey is a wonderful plant. I love it. It's not as good as the dandelions and the stinging nettle when it comes to the nutrients. In fact, it's relatively low in some of those macronutrients by comparison. But it grows so quickly and it can be harvested so many times during the year that I think it's a really easy plant to grow, and it's a wonderful addition to a fertilizer blend. And I did the same thing as I did with the other plants. I just went ahead and cut off some of the overgrown sections of the comfrey, and then I added those cuttings to that bucket of water. And so my basic recipe is a bunch of dandelions, a bunch of stinging nettle, and a bunch of comfrey. I didn't measure any of it. I put it in relatively equal amounts, but I don't think the ratio is that important. I'm just using plants already growing in my garden to make a free fertilizer, and it's that simple. If you have more stinging nettle, use more stinging nettle. If you only have dandelions, just use dandelions. You can develop your own recipe. With the plants in the bucket, now the bucket sits for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever time you have to allot to it. Put a cover over it to keep flies and maybe inquisitive dogs out, but it's just sitting. And it's getting stinky because the anaerobic bacteria are breaking this down. And it's the anaerobic bacteria that makes things smell. So doing this outside is the right way to do it. Don't even think about doing this in an enclosed space because it does smell really bad. And every couple days I would come in and take a stick and just stir things up a little bit. That introduces a little bit of oxygen, and so the aerobic bacteria do have a role to play, but it's really the anaerobic bacteria doing the bulk of the work. And so now, after 3 weeks, you can see that the plant material is mostly broken down. What's left are the stems and the thick veins of the leaves, and it's a sludge. It's a really dark liquid that remains. Now I'm going to take this and turn it into a liquid fertilizer. The first thing I want to do is to try to get rid of as many of these solids as possible. So I'm just going to stand back a little bit so it doesn't spatter and make me smell, and throw these clumps of plants onto my compost pile. This flat stick works good enough for me because I happen to have it right in hand. I've used trowels. The idea is just to get these big chunky pieces out of the liquid as much as possible. There are still some plant solids in this extract that I'm using to make fertilizer, and I want to filter out as much as possible. To do this, I'm using these buckets, and I've drilled holes in the bottom of one of these buckets. Now, I get these at my local bakery. This is what frosting comes in when they're making donuts and all the other wonderful sweets, and they give them away. I use them to grow plants, and I also use them for a process like this. So I'm going to place this sieve into another bucket, and then I'm going to take the blend and pour it in. Some of the soil particles that were around the roots stayed behind in the bucket. And now I'll just go ahead and, with Mala's help, let this drain through the bucket with the holes. And what's going to be left behind are some of the big chunks that still remain. This doesn't need to be perfectly filtered. It's okay if it's cloudy. I just want the big pieces removed. After it's all drained, you're left with a bucket of fertilizer. You could use it right now from the bucket. I like to go ahead and separate it into gallon containers at this point. So using my big funnel, I just pour it into gallon jugs. I like to put my homemade fertilizer into these gallon jugs for a few different reasons. First, that last part of the process, pouring from the bucket into the jug, helps refine it and filter it a little bit more. Some of the heavier sediments will stay behind in the bucket. I also think this is easier to store than a bigger bucket. I can just set these gallon jugs on a shelf in my greenhouse or in my shed, and it really makes for easy access. But I think the main reason why I like these jugs is because it makes for easy measuring. I'm going to add this concentrate of fertilizer to the water in my watering can. When you make your own fertilizer like this, you really don't know about the nutrients in it. You don't know how strong it is. You have an idea of what it contains, but it could be pretty strong. And as a concentrate, it could be too much for your plants. So it's a really good idea to take this fertilizer that you make and dilute it in water. I like to make a 10% blend. So I use 10% of this fertilizer and 90% of water. And to make that easier with this jug, I go ahead and mark into fifths. And each time I use it, I use 1/5 of the container. That's because I'm using a 2-gallon watering can. If I use 1/5 of a gallon of the fertilizer concentrate with 2 gallons of water, it gives me that 10% solution that I'm looking for. So I just pour some in, looking for the line on the jug. And when I get to that line, I know that I've got my targeted blend. This part of the process is just like the way I do my recipe. It doesn't need to be exact. If it's a little more than 1/5 of a gallon, so be it. A little bit less, it's really no big deal. I'm just trying to get close. I'm adding the nutrients to the water, and then I'll use this water to fertilize the soil around my plants. It's the soil that benefits from these extra nutrients. So I use it in my containers where the soil may not be as good as the rest of my garden. And I use it in beds with perennial flowers and fruits and vegetables, beds that I'm not regularly amending and improving the soil. By adding this fertilizer, I'm replacing some of the nutrients that will be lost because they're being used by these perennial plants. I don't use it in my main vegetable garden because I am regularly amending the soil in these beds, and I test the soil in these beds like I did recently with this one, and I know they're not deficient in nutrients, so there's no reason to add more. In other containers, like my green stock, I'll use it as well, but I won't put it through the main reservoir. I'll water each of the cells individually. That's because there are still some chunks that are left in this, and it might clog up the holes, but I can still benefit this container soil with this fertilizer blend. I'm really not worried about the particles that remain in this solution, big or small. Because I'm adding this to the soil, any of that organic matter that still resides in the liquid is being added to the soil and becomes food for soil microbes. There's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly what I'm doing when I'm amending my regular vegetable garden beds. Now, that 4-gallon bucket that I used made 3 gallons of solution. I've already used the first gallon. These other 2 will last me up to about 6 months. I try to use it all within that time, and I usually do. There's no problem whatsoever to keep it in storage. It does continue to smell, so when you use it, especially in a greenhouse, you're going to notice the aroma. So seal it in a container that allows you to close the top so it's not as noticeable. Each gallon of this fertilizer blend that I make will give me 10 gallons that I apply to the soil. So 3 weeks of work to make 3 gallons of concentrate and 30 gallons of what I actually use in my garden is a nice effort. And I could have made much more because I had a lot more plant material to use, but I only try to make as much as I think I can use within a few months. And I only apply this fertilizer a couple times a year. Early in the season when the plants are just beginning to grow and I can see that they can use a little bit of help, and then a little bit later when they're starting to set their flowers and fruit. And that's it. If I suspect a deficiency in a container or any bed, I can go to this product. But for those beds that I know the soil to be good, there's no reason to use it. And it's as simple as that. If you want to see more about how I garden, go ahead and watch this video next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.